Welcome to The Classical Mind, a podcast about the great books in the Western canons. We're your hosts. I'm Father Wesley Walker.
And I'm Dr. Junius Johnson.
Well, Junius, it's been a while since we've been able to record. How have you been since the last one?
Doing pretty well. Just plugging away at lots and lots to do.
Yes, always, especially this time of the year. I mean, we're recording kind of in the middle of May, so I imagine your teaching load is kind of culminating in all of the grading and final push to get everything done, huh?
And then there's also the end of the year for my kids and their school year, and there's always a bunch of assemblies and performances and things like that to go to. So it's a pretty busy time.
Absolutely. Well, we should maybe before we get in the book, we should briefly talk about a conference that you're going to be speaking at in June. Do you want to talk about that for a second?
Yeah. So Anika Prather, who's one of the co-authors of a book called The Black Intellectual Tradition,
and guest of the show.
And former guest of the show. And she is, that book is a very important book because it helps, particularly it helps African Americans to see the classical tradition not as a white tradition or something foreign, which that is a narrative you get in that community, but rather shows them how all the major thinkers of the great African American thinkers of the past were formed in that tradition and drew upon it deeply, not just for the external aspects of their rhetoric, but in fact how they fundamentally thought and argued for freedom and equality and these sorts of things. Well, she's putting on a conference at Catholic University next month called Redefining the Classics. And the idea is not to say what some people in certain sides of the political aisle have wanted to say, which is, well, we've got to stop reading all of these books, which have been so oppressive and whatnot for so long, and we've got to read all these other books instead, which are much more inclusive and everything like that. Anika's conference is, those of us who are involved in it are taking a very different approach, where we're saying, no, we don't need to change the books that are on the canon. We need to recognize the diversity that's already in the canon. And that's a diversity that is across any type of spectrum you want to think about, right? Racial, social, economic, national, all of those types of things. And so it's gonna be a good time. It's a free gathering, so if you're in the DC area, you should just come. You've got to register, but it doesn't cost you anything. So come hang out, have some great speakers, and have some great conversations.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a mission that's, I think, been sort of near and dear to the heart of what we're doing here from the beginning of the Classical Mind. And so we certainly want to be supportive of those efforts. And of course, listeners, DC is in my backyard, so I'll be there too. So Dr. Junius Johnson will be speaking. I'll be attending. And so if you want to come hang out with us, that would also be maybe an added draw. We'd love to be able to see you and meet you in person and get to chat with you about some of the great books that we've gotten to talk with each other about.
Yeah, let's get some selfies together.
That's right. Selfies. Very good. All right. Well, today we are here to talk about Lady of the Lake by Sir Walter Scott. Junius, you mentioned as we were getting ready, you read this first. Was it in high school or was it in college?
It was in college. So this was when I was in, I believe I had become an English major by this point. If not, I was right on the verge of doing so. And I don't remember how I first came across Walter Scott. Well, I do actually, because there was a movie of the book Ivanhoe that I saw when I was younger, and I loved it. And so, because it was medieval, and I loved all movies that were anything medieval. And so I read the book in college and thought it was great. And so, as is my normal mode of operating, once I find something that I like, I then go and read more from that author and see what else I might like about it. So I found myself at The Lady of the Lake, which is very suggestive. It's a great title. It makes you think about Arthurian stuff and whatnot. Has nothing whatsoever to do with King Arthur, but that kind of drew me in. What was very fascinating about this was, I think, I was still discovering that most of the great literature is long form poetry. I had, up until that point, I had read mostly prose. Any poems I'd been asked to read in school had been very short poems, sonnets and that sort of a thing. I don't know if we read any of the great epics, we read them in prose translation. And so I just didn't have the chops for reading long poetry. And I also was completely unaware of and unprepared for the fact that most of the great literature was in poetry form up until the 19th century. And so I was getting into something. You got to kind of build up your stamina a little bit for reading poems this long. And I was right at the beginning of that. It had an unusual effect on me. uh, it made me think in this meter and rhyme scheme, and it made me therefore want to write poems.
Hmm.
And so I wrote a lot of bad poetry in college. I still have most of it, and I have looked back over it and can tell you that it is in fact bad. But I didn't understand why I thought I could write poetry and spend so much time doing it. And then as I was rereading this time around, and I found myself walking. I was actually at an academic conference, and I found myself like in the bathroom of the academic conference, narrating things that have been going on to myself in this meter. And I realized, oh, that's what it was. I just spent so much time reading The Lady of the Lake that my brain kind of got locked into a groove, and I thought, hey, I'll just write poetry. Um, so anyway, it was very influential in my early development as a reader of poetry.
Hmm. Well, I think maybe you should slip me some of those poems and we could put them in the newsletter sometime.
There's not enough money in all the world to convince me to do that.
We could use a pen name.
Not now.
Uh, that's great. That's great. Well, this is my first time reading it, and as I was saying before we started recording, I enjoyed it. It was very different, and you're right. A lot of great literature has been written in poetry, but there did feel something a little different about encountering this text. I suppose it's not a translation from another language. That may be one of the differences. I mean, you think about the Iliad or Odyssey or Beowulf. I mean, those are translated into English, and some of them keep a poetic form. I know, like Fitzgerald's translations tend to do that, but um, I don't know. It just felt very different. So I was wondering if maybe you had a couple tips for someone who maybe is picking up a work like this for the first time. They're not used to reading long poetry. It does require different sort of brain muscles. So
Mm.
do you have any sort of tips to help people as they're trying to tackle a book like this?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I think you've got to recognize, and one of the differences that I think you might be noticing, Wesley, between this and some of the other long, lengthy poems you've read, is it is a fundamentally different genre of poetry than epic poetry. This is minstrelsy. And
Hmm.
so the idea is that this is the kind of thing that, you'd sit around the fire and a minstrel would kind of strum it out and sing it. Now, of course, originally so are the epic poems, but this is based on a fundamentally different cultural expression of minstrelsy. The lengths of the line are different. The rhythms within the meter, within the line itself, not to mention just the meter of the line as a whole, but the rhythms and the movement between the lines are also different. And so, this is meant to be really accessible from the standpoint of gather around everyone and listen to the stories, but at the same time it's coming from a culture that is not the culture any of us live in. Even if some of us are descended from this culture, we've not grown up in those spaces. And so the most important thing, and this is really true of all poetry, but it's especially true of minstrel poetry, is just let go. It's the kind of the same advice that my Latin teacher, Father Foster, would give us as we were trying to read some really difficult passage or whatnot. And he would say, just let yourself go and swim in the Latin. And I thought to myself, well, I don't know what that means, right? And that was my first thought. My second thought was, I can't swim. I'm going to drown. But I finally figured out what he was on about was to say, you've got to stop trying it consciously so much, beating your head against it, trying to make it make sense. And you've got to kind of take a more actively receptive stance and just let it kind of come into you and flow over you. The poem actually teaches you how to listen to it if you give yourself patiently to it. And I think that's something that any reader of long poetry who has gone into it without the chops has discovered, right? You pick up the Fairy Queen and you start reading the Fairy Queen, and it's a drag and it's hard and the language is a barrier and whatnot. But if you stick with it, after a dozen or so cantos of the thing, all of a sudden you find that it's making a lot more sense, and there's a point at which you're just reading it in a different level of fluency than you were before, and you didn't notice when that happened. I think that happens even faster with something like this if you give yourself over to the sound of it and the sweep of it, and don't push too hard to try to figure it out, or worry like, wait, who was that who did this or that thing, because it'll become clearer in the larger scope of the thing.
That
I would actually,
resonates with.
following that up, I mean, I think it might be nice if I just read a little bit of it to kind of get us into it a
Please
bit.
do it. Do it. Do it.
It does open
What you're
quite.
what you're saying resonates with my experience with the poem, which is when I sort of, I don't know, it would take a few minutes to get into a rhythm, but when you get into the rhythm, it flows much better. So like when you're not in the rhythm, it kind of drags. It feels like,
Mhm.
oh, this is taking forever. I've only read one page. But when you just kind of keep reading and keep that rhythm, it begins to make more sense.
Yeah.
And it was a very interesting phenomenon. It's very unlike most reading experiences, but it is a cool one. So yeah, please read it. That would be awesome.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I will say that if your stamina is up for it, I would also recommend reading it a canto at a time. So
Yep.
you read an entire canto at a sitting, because there is a unity and a whole to those things, and that we'd be rewarded for that. I'll just start from the beginning. Harp of the north that mouldering long hast hung on the witch elm that shades St. Fillan's spring, and down the fitful breeze thy numbers flung, till envious ivy did round thee cling, muffling with verdant ringlet every string. O minstrel harp, still must thine accents sleep, mid rustling leaves and fountains murmuring, still must thy sweeter sounds their silence keep, nor bid a warrior smile, nor teach a maid to weep. Not thus in ancient days of Caledon was thy voice mute amid the festal crowd, when lay of hopeless love or glory won aroused the fearful or subdued the proud. At each accord pause was heard aloud, thine ardent symphony sublime and high. Fair dames and crested chiefs attention bowed, for still the burden of thy minstrelsy was night's dauntless deed and beauty's matchless E. I gotta change that assonance there, because in Scots time they might still have been pronouncing I a bit more like E, and certainly in Scotland,
Mm.
he's called Sir Walter Scott, and that's not an accident. He does have this Scottish heritage, and he's deeply connected to all things Scottish, and that pervades a lot of his work. One of the main projects of his life was to go through Scotland and gather up all the minstrel songs he could, and all the tales and things like that he could, and publish those as a way of making sure those things didn't get lost as Scotland became more and more anglicized through his time. He's an fascinating figure. He
Mhm.
dies in 1832, I believe it is, and his death is one of the markers we use to mark the end of Romanticism. So I was taught in college, and that Romanticism began with the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798 and ended with the death of Sir Walter Scott in 1832. There's definitely other ways to think about that, but the idea that you could plausibly end the Romantic period with the death of this figure shows you how important he is to what's happening there. The period in English literature that immediately preceded that was the Gothic period, where you get things like the Mysteries of Udolpho and the Castle of Otranto, the Romance of the Forest, which was mentioned in Pride and Prejudice. And that period was a kind of early form of prose supernaturalism, where
Mhm.
crazy things would happen. The Castle of Otranto begins with a giant helmet falling out of the sky and crushing this guy in the bailey of his castle. That's pretty funny. So Scott's coming out of all that, and one of his earlier novels, The Bride of Lammermoor, is Gothic in that sort of a way. But he's also writing during the Romantic period. He's in conversation with all those guys, and he's bringing this Scotch element to it as well. So it's a really cool and unique blending of things that we see, and he's the most widely read of the Scottish poets, as it were.
Very interesting.
I'll tell
Jane
one more
Austen
story
sort of
about him.
pokes fun at both, right? I mean, we talked in the
Yes,
last episode about her poking fun at the of the sort of romantic, overly romantic, over sentimental novel, but she also made fun of the Gothic novel too,
she
right?
did. Yeah, that's right. And you see that even more in something like Mansfield Park or one of those other novels. She'll play with those conventions more. One of my favorite story about Walter Scott. I'll tell one more story, and then we'll actually talk about the poem. My favorite story about him, and I actually don't know if this is apocryphal or not, was that he was involved, and he started a publishing company with a friend of his, and it did not go well, and they wound up deep in debt because they weren't selling the books. And so his friend was like, well, we have to file for bankruptcy. And Scott says, no, there's no way I'm going to do that, because he knew that if they filed for bankruptcy, it would mean that all their debts would be canceled, and all those people they owed money to, they would all get screwed over because they wouldn't get
Hmm.
paid. And so he was like, no, my honor requires me to honor these debts and pay these guys off. So he decided that he would write to pay off those debts. And the Waverley novels, which are, I don't remember how many of these there are, there's like 20 or something of these Waverley novels. They were large. Most of those were his production to try to pay off that debt. And there's this is
Huh.
that's all accurate. And so the story then comes to, okay, one day a guy was in an inn, and he's sitting at the inn at the window taking his supper, and he calls the waiter over and says, "Take it away. I can't eat anymore." And the waiter's like, he's hardly touched his food, and the waiter says, "Is there something wrong with your food? We'd love to make it right." And he says, "No, there's nothing wrong with the food, but from where I'm sitting, I can just see across the square a window. And in the window, all I can see is a single hand writing by candlelight. And the industry of that hand is so inhuman that it takes away my appetite to think of the image of God destroying itself in such tireless effort. And I just can't eat anymore." And that was Walter Scott writing his way out of debt.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That's a good story.
So that's the kind of guy we're dealing with here.
Yes.
This poem
Absolutely.
comes from much earlier in his career, when and it was written at a time when um, he had some success as a poet before modest success, and everyone was kind of surprised that he was trying his hand at a long form poem like this, because it was really, really risky. And he was really convinced that he had a great thing and it was going to be really big, and he was right. It was a huge hit. It established him as one of the leading poets of his day and really set the stage for the rest of his writing career. So this was a very important moment for him.
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe we should get into the text a little bit here. So the story itself is, I wouldn't say it's overly complicated, but you do have everything you kind of need, in that there's political intrigue and the love triangle and all that stuff. Um, it's sort of settled in a or it's ensconced in a kind of area of history am still not very familiar with. Um, you basically have these Scottish clans that are fighting with each other, right? There's one rebellious clan, and so that kind of is the conflict underlying the work. There's the king, and then there's these rebels, and we begin with a character who we find out later is the king, but at the time is incognito.
Right. And what's interesting about that is that Scott showed an earlier version of this canto to someone when he was still writing the poem, and the person guessed pretty much right away that it was King James. And Scott was horrified, and he went back and made edits to make it less clear who the knight was, because he didn't want people to know that it was King James until the reveal later on in what, Canto 6 is it, or Canto 5?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. So the king is on a hunt, right, with some of his men, and he kind of gets separated from them.
Yeah.
And then he arrives at the loch, or the lake.
The loch.
The loch.
Yeah, and that's kind of sets the stage for this, right? We start with this knight who introduces himself as James Fitzjames, James the son of James. And that's it's a big clue, because this is James the sixth of Scotland and the first of England, and so the idea that it's a James who is particularly denoted by being the son of a James is kind of an interesting scenario there. But and I've always loved that idea of being the sixth of your name in one kingdom and the first of your name in a second kingdom, in terms of that I've just always been taken by that idea. So we're starting with him on the one side, and then the important encounter that the whole thing is really going to turn around is his meeting the Lady of the Lake, who is the daughter of the McGregor, right? Is it McGregor? Yeah, the daughter of the McGregor, and who is currently the McGregor's out of favor, not really exiled, but sort of under a black cloud because of rebellious activities against the crown in the past. And he has been doing everything he can to manage to make sure that England doesn't come in open war against the clans, because that's not something that the Scottish clans would be able to survive. But this relationship between the king and the daughter of this Scottish clan leader is going to be the central through line through here. And as we go through the poem, we're going to watch both of those characters interacting with the same other characters in interesting ways, where the daughter of the Douglas is going to repudiate Roderick Dhu, who is the de facto leader of the United Scottish Forces. He's looking at her as, if I could marry her, that would unify all the clans in a really undeniable way, bringing the McGregor clans together. And also, he seems to be genuinely in love with her as well. It's not just a political thing. She's not interested because her heart belongs elsewhere. And then so there's that relationship there. And then of course King James and Roderick Dhu have this grief with each other because Roderick committed a crime against an English lord, and King James wants to bring him to justice for that. And so their reciprocal relationships to Roderick Dhu, to her father, to the Douglas, all the way throughout, you're kind of watching the two halves of this as they dance their way from that initial meeting by chance at the shores of the Loch, all the way to their final meeting in the sort of temporary throne room that the king has in the palace that he's inhabiting in Scotland, where he's in a position, having resumed his rightful identity, to set everything to rights and give us a happy ending.
Yes. So there are a few aspects of the poem I wanted to talk about, and I know there's probably plenty of more you do, but I was hoping maybe we could talk a little bit about the not the, I guess, the metaphysics of the play, or the fact that you have kind of these prophecies in it. But it doesn't strike me as particularly a Christian vision of prophecy. It's in fact, in many ways, it's very pagan. So we have Brian the Hermit, right, is his name, who delivers a prophecy where he predicts the fall of the clan Alpine, and then the reconciliation that would come after that. And we see, I think, something we've pointed out in the past, especially when we did Oedipus. There's a sort of a parallel, in my opinion, with the reaction to the prophecy. So of course, the king is very encouraged by it, but Roderick is sort of defiant about it. And one can think of, like, how Oedipus wants to do everything he can to avoid the prophecy, but it nevertheless comes true. And I think you see a sort of similar move here with Roderick. He fights in many ways very bravely, but he can't escape fate.
What's fascinating about that is that Roderick brings up the prophecy as a way of sort of explaining to James, whom he doesn't know as the king, that this is an important fight, because the prophecy is that whoever sheds blood first that side's gonna win. And then the king is like, well, then it's already too late because I've already killed one of your dudes. And Roderick's like, well, forget prophecy. Who cares about prophecy anyway? I'm going to fight you. So Roderick takes comfort in the prophecy when he thinks he's got agency to make it bend to his will. When he realizes that he's actually already compassed by it, he doesn't really care about it anymore. He's going to charge ahead anyway. And that's his character, right? He's kind of a hothead. And he does represent this. You want to say it's stereotypical Scot. Sir Walter Scott is writing from the perspective of the Englishman, even though he's got this deep love and connection to Scotland, and so he's an interesting figure in that way, sitting on both sides of that line, but ultimately siding with the English side of it. And there's a stereotype of the Scotsman as being this sort of hot-headed, powerful warrior, but who doesn't think things through and who can be overcome by culture and a good plan and that sort of business. And even in the fight between the two, we see that Roderick Dhu is clearly the stronger of the two, but James Fitzjames is schooled in all the proper fencing, proper swordplay, and it's really not close. It's really not an issue, except for at the very end, Roderick almost overcomes him by sheer brute force, but he'd already received the fatal wound by that point.
That's right.
So yeah, that is fascinating, the way that prophecy it's invoked. I mean, the Brian the Hermit is described in explicitly anti-Christian terms. I mean, this dude is not just pagan, but he's actually like kind of a Satanist almost. It's really quite interesting. One of my favorites, he kicks off one of my favorite sequences in the poem, which is when the call to war goes running through the Scottish towns. And so somebody has to pick it up and carry it to the town and declare it and hand it to somebody else, and he's got to go to the next one. And that's how they muster the men up. And that's a beautiful sequence, because you see all of these moments in the life of the everyday life of the clansmen that are being interrupted by the call to war, including a guy taken away from the altar at his wedding. and he's got to leave his wife behind and go off to war. And you see that she's like, no, you're a good Scotsman. You've got to answer this. There's not this, oh no, please don't go, weeping that you might have gotten further south in the country. So yeah, it's really fascinating. And I think that it's good to point out that there is a collision of Christianity and paganism that's evident here, where up in the Highlands, they're more connected to and still committed to the old ways. Yeah. And even while they have converted and they are Christians, nevertheless, this pagan hermit still has a place and is still honored for his role.
And still has a sort of a kind of power. I mean, his prophecy is not wrong.
Yep. Yeah, biblically that makes him a true prophet, right? His prophecy comes true. So
that's true. That's true. Yes, I guess he's sort of almost like a Balaam figure in that regard. I mean, he's being used, but he's maybe he's not on the right side. Yeah, very interesting character.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. One of the things I should point out, just it may encourage people to hear me say this. I find it hard to follow who the poem is talking about sometimes.
Yes.
What's our young man's name? Is it the Douglas? Am I getting that right? The one that the Lady of the Lake eventually winds up with at the end.
Oh, Malcolm.
Malcolm, yeah, Malcolm. Sometimes I'm confused between Malcolm and the old McGregor, and sometimes I'm confused. Roderick Dhu is a little easier to keep the track apart, but I do have some issue following who he's being referred to sometimes, because they'll be referred to in these oblique ways that reference their ancestry or something like that. And I think, all of these figures are famous enough that were I steeped in this stuff, that wouldn't be a problem, but I'm not steeped in this stuff. And so sometimes I lose the thread of the narrative a bit and have trouble keeping up with what's what. So if you're reading and you're having that problem, you're not alone. I have that problem sometimes too. And I do find generally the best thing to do is just keep reading, and something will happen that'll make it clear who he's talking about.
Yeah, I have the same experience, I think. Well, it's hard because isn't Ellen's father named James as well? Isn't it James Douglas? If I remember correctly, which made it more complicated because it's just like, because we already have James Fitzjames, who's also the other James. And then you got the other James. So it is a little hard at times, but I think keep reading.
And in fact, even at the end, when things are resolved, the way he describes the end of it, this is the very last action of the poem. Malcolm Graham, whose name is pronounced Graham, in the way it's named, rhymed in the poem. So let's see. Okay, and at the word, down kneeled the Graham to Scotland's lord. For thee, rash youth, no suppliant sues. He's given Ellen a chance to ask for Malcolm's life as her boon, because the thing she would have asked for, her father's life, has already been granted. And so she's got a leftover boon from the king that she can ask for. And so she could ask for Malcolm's life to be spared, and she doesn't. And so he says, well, for thee, rash youth, no suppliant sues. From thee may vengeance claim her dues, who nurtured underneath our smile has paid our care by treacherous wile, and sought amid thy faithful clan a refuge for an outlawed man, dishonoring thus thy loyal name, fetters and warder for the Graham. And the man he has hidden has been the Douglas, who is Ellen's father. He's the one that Malcolm has been protecting, who has now been reconciled to the king. And so the king says, look, since I gave her a chance, but she didn't want to plead for you, so there's nobody to intercede for you, so you have to face the full might of my justice, and I doom you to chains. And the chains he dooms her to is he takes his own chain of gold around his neck and throws it over Malcolm, and then gives it to Ellen, which is a sign that he's giving him to her in marriage.
Yeah.
And so that's his punishment, is that he's got to marry the woman that he loves and that loves him, and that should have asked for his freedom in the first place. Right? It's a beautiful moment of the king's mercy, and he's being really funny here at the end.
Yes.
And we're not given in direct language the story of what happened. We've just got to recognize that that's what's happening in that last moment.
That's right. Yes. It's not the worst punishment of marriage in the last two books we've read.
It's true. It's not. So, listeners, this is a good time for us to tell you that marriage is not, in fact, meant to be a punishment, and
It's
you can
not.
do better than that. So, if you're
Aim
unmarried,
high.
yeah, that's right. Aim high if you're unmarried. If you are married, make do. So,
That's right. That's right. Only sacrament to exist before the fall.
there you go. Oh, that's funny. Um, gosh, no, I forgot what I was going to say about this. Um, okay, there's a bit the role of honor throughout
Yes.
this, which is one of the main themes, and it really connects well with a lot of other things that we've been reading, and also just a lot of books in the classical tradition. Period. Right, as we're going all the way back to the Iliad, honor plays a huge role in what's going on here. And there are multiple aspects of this. There's the honor of the guest, which comes up multiple times,
Hmm.
nowhere more importantly than when Fitzjames comes across Roderick Dhu up on the Highlands alone, and Roderick Dhu invites him into his camp, and then Fitzjames declares that he's an enemy of Roderick Dhu, but Roderick has already offered hospitality, and so he's not free to take that back. He says, listen, you being his enemy makes you my enemy, but for the night, you're safe because
Yeah.
I pledged you my hospitality. I'll admit, I thought that the king had come upon the Douglas at that point and not upon Roderick Dhu. So I read
Mm.
that whole encounter differently all the way until he summoned up his forces later on the next day. But this is uh there's this courtly dance that goes on, even a chivalrous dance. This notion of, well, you're my sworn enemy, and I can't wait to get your blood. But I said I would escort you as far as the river, so I'm gonna do that. But as soon as we get to the river, we're gonna fight. Or you're safe in my household tonight, whoever you may be, because I've offered you that. It's really beautiful. It's really cool. It's also good to see how late in European culture this idea survives. We're not talking about 1200 BC here. We're talking about this. This all takes place in the beginning of the 17th century. Um, and so it's really lovely to see those connections in place and to see the ways that how seriously these men take their honor and the things they're willing to do with it and to defend it and all of that.
You sort of have honor operating on so many different levels of the story too. I mean, there's on one level kind of the honor of one's clan, which is
Hmm.
so important. Which is maybe, I mean, I know we might think of like family pride in our context, but we have such a, I think, narrower view of that.
Yeah.
But clan honor was really important. So you have that aspect. You do have this courtly or chivalric kind of honor, in which, courage, loyalty, courtesy, faith, generosity. I mean, all that kind of is playing, and we've seen a lot of that this year. I feel like with some of our readings. I mean, Troilus, I think, was another
Hmm.
place where that all came up. So you had that level of it, and then you have, I think, on there's sort of a personal level. I mean, I think the way King James acts at times reflects a kind of personal honor, but also you could think of
Hmm.
a character like Ellen, who is, incredibly, I think, virtuous, loyal, principled, um,
Hmm.
and so I think it's interesting because the story in many ways feels like uh, what happens when you create tensions between some of those different kinds of
Yeah.
honor.
Yeah, that's right.
But I think that really cool. It's really cool. It brings out an aspect of the story that I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, I think that's very right. And one of the things it does enable Scott to do is to show the Scots leaders as honorable men. Every
Yeah.
one of them is honorable, right? I mean, Roderick Dhu is the one that he's the one you would expect to be the rabid dog who doesn't give a fig for honor, and he shows himself to be deeply honorable in all of the
Yes.
ways that he behaves, and whatnot. And there's that one incident which is a bit strange right before he comes across Roderick when he meets the English woman who's been kidnapped and has been held, who's been trapped in Scotland for all these years, and she's at the end of her life now. And he gets angry at the treatment she's received, and this is one of the reasons he thirsts for the blood of Roderick. Is he wants vengeance for her, and he cuts off a lock of her hair to take with him
Hmm.
as a pledge until he's actually able to consummate that vengeance. And he does dip that blood in the hair in Roderick's blood after he defeats him. And so this is again a sort of chivalric knightly honor, but it's not the generic knightly honor of knights. All knights behave this way. It's now, here is a maiden who came under my potential protection, and I wasn't strong enough to protect her, and so I'm going to avenge her. and you get that coming in into his motivations as well.
Mm, mhm, mhm.
And in spite of all of that, in spite of all of those incitements to battle, the king offers Roderick a chance not to have the battle. He says, "Listen, we've had a chance to talk, and you've explained your side of this. I think we can handle this differently. We don't have to fight to the death right here. We could stop this whole thing and sort of step things back a little bit." And Roderick's not interested in that, right? He wants to have his battle, and so that's what's going to happen. But it's interesting to me that like this is this is a really positive portrayal of King James, that he is able to reconsider his position, reconsider his anger, and all these other sorts of things, and think, well, mercy is a part of my honor too. Considering what Roderick and his people have suffered is also a part of my honor. I think that's a big part of what this thing is about. It's very much an apology for the English in relation to how they behave towards the Scottish, even while it's an apology for the Scottish to the English, who have a tendency to think of them as savages and barbarians and that sort of a
Yes.
thing.
In this way, I did find the poem to be deeply humanizing. I thought that was a good thing. In fact, I was thinking a little bit about Roderick in terms of what we might think of as villains in our
Mm,
world. And I mean, in contemporary storytelling, it's not even that we like a compelling villain anymore. It's that we like a hero who's really an anti-hero.
yeah.
But here, you almost get the reverse move in so far as Roderick he's the villain, but he's almost like an anti-villain, because
Mm,
he is a noble character, and that's just not something you see a ton of
yeah.
in our modern storytelling. But I think that's an excellent example of James is an excellent example of imagination for a leader who's willing
Mm,
to think beyond the sort of cliche or what seems set in stone, and is willing to offer new ways forward. And of course, the problem with that is it does require more than just him. It's a two-way street, and
yeah.
Roderick won't do it. But it is interesting. Their relationship is fascinating, and at one point it kind of reminded me a little of Saul and David.
Mm,
David cutting the patch off of Saul's cloak in the
hmm.
cave.
Yeah. I could have killed you.
Yep.
Yeah, when Roderick summons up all the men and shows the king just how surrounded he's been the whole time, and then is like, sends him away and says, "No, but so I want you to know you are only alive because of the word of the clansman, right? Because Roderick Jew is good to his word."
Yeah.
That's a cool moment. There's also so what we're saying here about the relationship between these two, and remembering that the summons has gone out and all of the Highland clans have mustered for battle, and a battle does in fact take place, a battle at which neither the king nor the clan head are present. After Fitzjames and Roderick have their duel, and Fitzjames returns to the castle, the armies of the English and the Scottish meet, and a battle is fought. Even though the king sends word to try to stop it, the word doesn't get there in time. Um, what happens, so what's important is the Douglas steps up and takes on himself the welfare of the people. He doesn't know what's happened to Roderick yet. All he knows is that he might be able to offer himself up to the king and buy safety for everyone else. And so we see him acting in the way that a leader should act. He essentially receives the mantleship of the clans, passes from Roderick to the Douglas, where it really probably ought to have been in the first place if the Douglas were not already under a black mark with the king. And that enables the Douglas to intercede with the king for the safety of the clans. And we don't get to see the important encounter. But by the time Ellen comes in to plead for her father's life, and we expect, okay, she's going to give him the ring, and then she's going to discover that he's really the king, and then he's going to pardon her pardon. We discover that her father's already been pardoned, and they've already made friendship. And so all of the thing that happened that resolves all of this background tension that's been boiling over around the fringes of the poem, that happens off screen. And it focuses the poem back on the title character, the Lady of the Lake. It's not actually James's story or Roderick's story or the Douglas's story. It's really Ellen's story.
Hmm.
And it's the story of how she is placed in the center of all these great events without any agency at the beginning of the poem, but how by being just by being beautiful and courteous, she gains agency, And by gaining the king's ring, she gains agency of a sort that nobody else in Scotland has, that she's able to bring to that last encounter.
Let me ask you a question from your perspective. Why do you think she ends up with Malcolm and not the king?
Well, history is one thing.
That's true.
You
Well,
know, you're
yeah,
writing a historical thing,
sure.
you can't create a new queen. But I think it's also because the poem to me is about, it's about healing and this like really, really broken relationship between these two nations
Yeah.
that are somehow one. That's why it's this James that's chosen. He's the first king of both.
Hmm.
Right. And so it's this, and it's right there in his name, James the Sixth of Scotland, the first of England. Really underscores something new is going on here. And so we need to see the healing of England to Scotland, but we also need to see for the Scots, for his Scots audience, I think we also need to see the healing of Scotland, healing within Scotland. And so uniting the daughter of the Douglas with the Graham is a way of showing a kind of type of clan unity that is, I think, allows the Scots to feel really good about the fact that we can be good vassals of England without losing everything that's important to us about who we are.
Mm, that's good. Yeah, I think you're right. Well, what else should we talk about in this book?
One thing to keep an eye on in this book, as you're reading it, and especially if you wanted to talk about it with people, is this old minstrel who is attached to
Hmm.
the Douglas household, and he follows her around. He sings several songs. The meter changes when we go into the minstrel songs, and so that's something to take note of.
Yep.
Um, and you know, he is what Walter Scott is. He is the Walter Scott character in the poem, the one who watches events and knows the characters and reads what's going on and then sings the songs so that later generations can remember. He sings songs to Ellen that are meant to send her spirit down certain pathways, at both at her request and also not at her request. He's there to sing a dirge over the death of Roderick Dhu. Uh, by mistake, everyone thinks that he's Roderick's man when he's looking for the Douglas, and so he's led to the wrong place, and that puts him in the right place to sing a song of lament
Mm.
over Roderick Dhu. And he's Ellen's only companion when she goes in to meet the king, and she's facing these mercenaries who don't know who she is, and who are on the verge of potentially perpetrating some maybe even sexual violence against her. I mean, she's walking into a very dangerous situation, and her minstrel goes in there with her, because whatever happens, the minstrel's got to be there to sing about it. And I think that, you know, the poem begins and ends with the harp of minstrelsy, with a sort of palinode to that idea. And I think in watching carefully the figure of the old minstrel in the poem, we see something of how Scott thinks of himself in relation to all these events that he's talking about as well. Even though they were before Scott's time by centuries,
That's right.
you know, he's really placing himself in this story. And Scott is one of the pioneers of the historical romance. We have historical romance as a genre in large part because of Scott's novels.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, Alan Bain sort of acts as the he's like the voice of reason in the story. It's a very
Mm,
yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah,
And you can kind of see Scott doing that. I mean, in this way of depicting the Scots and the British, he is trying to sort of speak reason for both sides, I think. And
yeah,
yeah, that's exactly
yeah.
right.
One of the things that I have this really old edition from the 19th century that is not going to stand up to that many more readings without some serious repairs. The pages are starting to crack at the binding, but it looks really cool when you walk around reading it. People are like, "Ooh, what are you reading?" Well, I'm reading Sir Walter Scott's Lady of the Lake, and then you get points. But it's got loads and loads of notes, and
Mm.
some of the notes are quotes from articles written about the poem during Scott's life, like the initial critical reception of it, as different reviewers would say, you know, oh, you know, Scott really does a great job here of blah blah blah, or you know, this very bad song is a lamentable piece of writing for one of our country's great poets, and things like that. But some of the other things it points to, and honestly, I couldn't read a lot of them because just the time that I had, I needed to spend my time reading the poem. But one of the other things these notes show a lot of is there are real historical events that are being referenced that are displaced in time from the narrative we're being told. So he's borrowing from other actual things that happened in Scottish history to different people at different times to fill out some of this account. And he's borrowing from things that are truth about the life. Like King James really did go around in disguise
Yes.
using a fake name when he wanted to go hunting. It wasn't James Fitzjames. Sky couldn't use his actual real fake name because then everyone would know who he was talking about, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of that. This poem is actually deeply researched and deeply embedded in a lot of history. And so one of the reasons I like having people read this poem, if you're thinking, what's a good use of this poem pedagogically? Well, if you're going to talk about Scotland, and if you're going to talk about the relationship of Scotland and England, this is a really great way to give the students a deeply immersive sense of what you're on about without having to spend hours and hours describing it or whatnot. And you don't, it's the same type of thing you would be doing if you were showing them something like Braveheart, except that you can do it with a great work of literature that by someone who has spent, just years of his life trying to understand and preserve that culture.
Yeah, that's true. There were some of those I didn't catch a ton of them because I was using the Kindle version, which this is the first time I've really done a Kindle version for any of the books we've read, and I do regret it a little bit. But as some of those references did come up, the ones that I kind of caught or was made aware of through some extra reading, it did remind me slightly, though I think this is more rigorous, of like Macbeth with Shakespeare and how he does something very similar at times where he'll put things from other eras into the play to kind of give it another dimension or to even make kind of clever points for his patrons or those who would have been aware of certain political things going on in his own day.
Yeah, that's right. And that's a great pairing for this, right? The Scottish play with this Scottish lay. That would be a really good unit if you were putting a course together.
Absolutely.
Well, can I lead us out of the poem by reading the end?
Absolutely. Yes. I
We
think it
read the
must be done.
beginning, so let's read the end. Harp of the North, farewell. The hills grow dark, on purple peaks a deeper shade descending. In twilight copse the glowworm lights her spark. The deer half seen are to the covert wending. Resume thy wizard elm, the fountain lending, and the wild breeze thy wilder minstrelsy, thy numbers sweet with nature's vespers blending, with distant echo from the fold and lea, and herd boy's evening pipe, and hum of housing bee. Yet once again, farewell, thou minstrel harp. Yet once again, forgive my feeble sway, and little reck I of the censure sharp may idly cobble at an idle lay. Much have I owed thy strains on life's long way, through secret woes the world has never known, when on the weary night dawned wearier day, and bitterer was the grief devoured alone. That I o'erlive such woes, enchantress, is thy known. That's a brilliant stanza. Sorry, it's really cool. He's talking about how I don't care about the criticisms that's going to come. They're idle criticisms directed at an idle poem, which is what this is. But he says, I have survived the difficulties of life through the power of poetry, through the sound of this harp, right? The fact that I have overlived woes where weary night dawned on wearier day is due to the enchantment of the harp of minstrelsy, which is the title of his collection of all the poems of Scotland, by the way, the harp of minstrelsy. Hark, as my lingering footsteps slow retire, some spirit of the air has waked thy string. 'Tis now a seraph bold with touch of fire, 'tis now the brush of fairy's frolic wing. Receding now the dying numbers ring, fainter and fainter down the rugged dell, and now the mountain breezes scarcely bring a wandering witch note of the distant spell. And now 'tis silent all. Enchantress, fare thee well. And so he's comparing the minstrelsy, the songs that he's able to sing, and the muse that is the very harp of the very whole history of Scottish song is his muse. And he's comparing that to the sounds you hear on the Scottish Highlands and how that stirs up all of that. So in a sense, the song of the Scottish minstrels is just the song of the land. And the people that it tells about are people who have heard the song because they live in the right place to hear that music. It's really, it's a delightful little thing, and it is a difficult read, but if you've got the chops for it, I highly recommend it because it is full of so many gracious little touches like that.
I love it. A good way to end. Well, speaking of ending, then that brings us to Endnotes.
It
So,
notes.
Junius, what's your end note for this book?
I thought about a lot of things, and I'm going to go with another one of Walter Scott's novels, Rob Roy, which tells of Rob Roy McGregor, who is the Scottish Robin Hood. And there was a movie made about Rob Roy, and I did see it a long time ago. I don't remember how close it was to the novel. I don't even know if it was based on the novel or not. So I'm not recommending the movie, but I would recommend Scott's novel. It is, this type of prose. Again, if you love Pride and Prejudice, you should be right at home in Scott's writing, and it's just transports you. It's delightful, and it's a really cool take on a theme that we love. Right, we love Robin Hood stories. Well, this is the Scottish version of that, and so Rob Roy is my end note.
Yeah, interesting. So I don't have nearly any reading or understanding of Scottish history, so I sort of felt handicapped a little bit in picking an end note. But um, to connect it to a work we've done before,
Mm,
my end note will be Frederick Douglass.
mm.
Frederick Douglass, when he ran away, changed his last name so that he couldn't be tracked by his former purported owner, and he was asking one of his friends basically, what should I change it to? And his friend had just read Lady of the Lake and suggested that he choose the name Douglas.
That's so
So that's
brilliant.
so that's where Frederick Douglass comes from. So if you really want to do a nice classical mind pairing, I feel like it's,
Nice.
like Steak and Wine or something, then maybe read Lady of the Lake and then read some Frederick Douglass.
That is so brilliant, right? I mean, it's because you have the Douglas, who's Ellen's father, living in exile. I mean, it's just so thematically appropriate, and that's Anika's point right there about how the great African American thinkers, it all is in the classics. It's all steeped in that tradition and whatnot. So it's a great suggestion.
Maybe we could have her back on at some point soon to talk about another book, because I really enjoyed conversations with her and I really love what she's doing.
Yeah, but we can talk to her about it next month.
That's right. That's right. Awesome. Very good. Well, our next book will be Confessions by St. Augustine. It was our listener choice. So if you support the podcast monetarily, you get to nominate books and then we put them up for vote. What won was Confessions. It actually won pretty handily, too. I was kind of surprised at that, but in a good way. So I'm very, very, very excited to talk about Confessions with you next month, Junius. I think it'll be an awesome conversation.
Yeah, that's gonna be that's one of the giants of the literature, and it's gonna be really fun to dig into.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, in the meantime, keep reading.